I'd like you to imagine something with me this morning. Imagine that you are a member of the church in the ancient city of Colossae. One day out on the streets, you run into a friend of yours, a secular friend, and the two of you fall into conversation. Your friend says to you, that group that you're a part of, what is it that you call that? You say, it's a church. Church, okay. And you all follow someone? Yes, we do. Who do you follow? We follow Jesus. Jesus. Where's he from? He's from Nazareth. Never heard of the place. Well, it's a little backwater town over in Palestine. Palestine? Wow, he's from a long ways off. Does he still live there or live here? Well, he doesn't live in either. He actually lived and died 30 years ago. And wait. 30 years ago? 30 years ago? He's been gone for 30 years? I guess you could say that. So you follow someone that is from somewhere a long way from here, someone that isn't even alive anymore, and you call that a church? This is the one you follow? Well, you see, you have to understand. We believe he's alive, that he arose and ascended on high. Oh, says your friend, I see. So he's kind of like the angelic intermediaries that I hear everybody around here talking about anymore. All those spirit realm people. That's what he's like? Well, no, not really. Although truth be told, into our church, we've been having some problems with that same talk. A lot of people are talking about that too, and they're kind of forgetting about Jesus and focusing on that. And your friend says, well, I can understand that. It's exciting talk. I've gotten kind of interested in that. Well, you say, wait a minute. That's not what Jesus is. We need to be thinking about him. And then your friend looks at you and asks you 3 questions. And you have to ponder to think of the answer. He says, okay, well, if he's not one of those spirit emanations, the spirit world kind of thing, if he's not that, then who is this Jesus? And what does he have to do with your church? And what does he have to do with you? Well, you're kind of thinking about how you're going to answer that question. When suddenly the answer is there, you say, I know what you should do. What's that? Well, we just got a letter from one of our important leaders, a guy named Paul, and they're going to be reading it at the church tonight. Well, why don't you come and listen to the letter? And I think maybe your questions will be answered. Oh, no. I'm not into that kind of stuff. No, come on. You had the questions. I'm not sure I can answer all those things. You don't have to do anything. Just come and sit beside me and listen. Hey, it's not every day we get letters about this part of the world. Come and enjoy it. Well, your friend thinks about it a minute. All right, nothing else going on around this place. I guess I'll go find out what y'all are doing. In ancient Colossae, they spoke with a southern accent. And so he joins you. And off to the church you go. You sit down to listen. When the reader gets up to read, you will find it in your Bibles, page 1753 in your Pew Bible, Colossians 1. As you sit there listening to the reading, you're still thinking about those questions. Who is this Jesus? What does he have to do with the church here in Colossae? And what does he have to do with you? You're still thinking those, and you're hoping they will somehow be answered in what the reader reads from the Apostle Paul. He's not gotten far into the letter when suddenly he comes to 2 paragraphs that contain 3 simple principles of Paul's that just might be the answer. And that's where we focus today. We start with that first question. Who is Jesus anyway? We're going to read the opening verses to this section. But first, here's Paul's principle. Jesus is the one supreme over all. Jesus is the one supreme over all. Colossians chapter 1, I begin reading in verse 15. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Who is Jesus? He is the one supreme over all. You're kind of keeping an eye on your friend out of the corner of your eye as the reader reads those words, because they speak in exalted terminology of this Nazarene. What is it that Paul says? He opens by saying the Son is the image of the invisible God. In that world and time, an image was not viewed as being separate from and distinct to that which it depicted, but rather a part of it. So when Paul writes, he is the image of the invisible God, what he is writing is, Jesus is God himself. You watch your friends. No reaction. A little widening of the eyes maybe. And the reader continues. The firstborn over all creation. Now, when we hear that term, firstborn, we think of somebody who was born first. Surprising how that works. The firstborn child you've had. But in the context of Colossae, especially with the backdrop of the Old Testament, it would not have been first in chronological sequence, but first in status and importance. Kind of like walking into a room where there are a lot of military officers milling about of all different ages. You notice that everybody seems to be focusing in on one officer in particular. He's not the youngest, but certainly not the oldest in the room. As you get closer, you discover why. That officer is a general. They're all saluting the general. Not first chronologically, but first in status. And that's where Paul begins. He says he is God himself, but he became a part of creation. And as a part of creation, he is the first in status in creation. Now your friend leans over to you and says, excuse me, how long ago did he live? You say 30 years. I see. I mean, just think about that. 30 years ago, there were people still alive. I don't know if they were in Colossae, but they were all around the Mediterranean basin who had known Jesus of Nazareth personally. There were people alive who had vivid memories of watching him at the end of a long day with the crowd pressing in upon him, looking into his face and seeing there in that human face all of the signs of utter physical and emotional exhaustion. He was tired. There were those alive who remembered him at the end of a long day saying, is there anywhere around here we can get some food? I'm starving. Others who remember as he pulled his disciples away from the crowd and said to them, we've got to find a quiet place. We've got to go get some rest from all these people. Others who remembered on those hot days with the sun beating down on the dusty pathways, Jesus saying, where's the nearest place to water? I'm dying of thirst. 30 years ago. They remembered all of that. This human man. 30 years ago from now. Do you remember what was in the news 30 years ago? 30 years ago, Nelson Riddle had laid down his baton for the last time. 30 years ago, Yul Brynner looked into the television camera and choked out the words, don't smoke like I did. 30 years ago, Rock Hudson was in the news. AIDS, a strange and frightening new disease, was making the headlines 30 years ago. Many here remember all of that. That's about how long it had been for those in Colossae to the time of Jesus, 30 years ago. And now they receive a letter from Paul, and they listen to those claims. Anyone who had known Jesus must have wondered, that man with whom I walked the pathway from home to the marketplace, whom I listened to his voice teaching, And now along comes the apostle and says, he is the one supreme over all. He is God. He is the first in status in all of creation. Wow. Exalted language. And Paul isn't done yet. Because Paul will continue writing. He says, he is above all rulers and authorities and powers and dominions. In fact, if Paul stood here today and said the same to us, he might say it like this. Where's the power, the rule, the authority, the dominion now? The Kremlin, you say? Jesus is Lord over the Kremlin. The Hague, the justice they dispense there is a mere dim reflection of the justice of Jesus. 10 Downing Street, you say? No, that's on loan from Jesus to the British Empire. That egg-shaped oval you call the Oval Office, no, highly contested, no, that's the sandbox in which Jesus plays. He is supreme over all. Everywhere you look in creation, you see his handiwork. Everywhere you look within creation, you see his fingerprints. In fact, Paul would say, even if you delve down into the deepest cellars of the human soul, where no eye can see, there you will find the footprints of Jesus. You sit listening to this. You've grown a bit uncomfortable because you can only imagine how this is affecting your friend. You're trying to watch without being obvious. Even you are thinking, all of these claims. I see only two possibilities. On the one hand is outrageous laughter at the absurdity of it all. Or on the other, to stagger back in awe at the grandeur of this God-man called Jesus. You glance at your friend, and your friend is not laughing. But the reader continues. Your friend had asked, who is this Jesus? Well, he's the one supreme over all. Your friend had asked, what does he have to do with the church in Colossae? Well, Paul is about to say, Jesus is the one supreme over all the church. Colossians 1, this time reading from verse 18. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. What does he have to do with this church, as you call it, in Colossae? Had been your friend's question. Did you live in the 21st century? That question might be, what does he have to do with Loma Linda University Church? What does he have to do with the Seventh-day Adventist Church? What does he have to do with the Christian faith as a whole? And Paul's words in the letter answer. Right at the beginning of verse 18, he says, he is the head over his body, the church. In other words, Jesus is the one supreme over all the church. That's a stunning claim. It's as stunning as it is simple. Stunning. He is over the multiplied billions of followers who have taken on his name on this planet over 2 millennia. Head over it. But it's simple. He is head, supreme over the church. And you ask, but Randy, what does that mean? After all, throughout 2 millennia of Christian history, we seem to have had a bit of a difficult time figuring out exactly who is the head of the church. So when we read it back there, when we listen to what would have been read in that letter, we ask, what does it mean, head of the church? What does it mean? Well, I suppose it means if you want to talk to the head of the church, you don't go to Rome. You don't go to Constantinople. You don't go to Alexandria. And you certainly don't go to Silver Spring, Maryland. If you want to talk to the head of the church, you press into the very presence of God, where you will find the head of the church seated at his right hand. That's the head of the church. That's what it means. What does it mean, you ask? The head of the church. Well, I suppose it means that when you speak to the head of the church, you don't say, Your Holiness, or Your Excellent, or Mr. President of the GC. That's not how you speak. Maybe you will use his favorite self-designation. You will speak to the Son of Man. That's what it means. He's the head of the church. What does it mean? It means if you want to talk to the under-shepherds of the church, those who have been involved in doing the ministry for the one who is the head of the church, do not look first for those who are regally robed and royally lauded. Do not look first to those who receive the applause of the world and the attention of the media. Do not look first to the who's who in the church. Look first instead to those countless numbers of under-shepherds who have served him on 1,000 different shores with no notice by human eye, no acclaim by human media, but have nevertheless served him to the point of the giving of their blood because of their faithfulness to him. Look deep into their hearts, deep into their lives, deep into their eyes, and you will see imprinted there the image of him who is the head of the church. Because the witness of one apostle is that as we follow him, we are transformed more and more into the likeness of the one who said, I am gentle and humble in heart. I did not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life a ransom for many. And it is that theme that Paul picks up here, and he says, you ask what it means for him to be the head of the church? It means that he would rupture the tomb in two. He would defeat and conquer and vanquish death. I'll tell you, Paul says, what it means. He will take the instrument of the most horrific human torture, the crucifixion, and transform it into the symbol of the most vibrant living hope, the cross. And then he will take all of those who take the cross and he will bind them and bond them together in a fellowship called his body, the church, of which he is the head. Maybe Paul would say, that's what it means to be head of the church. And your friend asks, in a loud whisper, he's talking about that teacher from Nazareth, right? And you say, yes, he is. So he's the head of your church here and everywhere. Yes, he is. And the letter reader continues to read. Your friend had 3 questions. Who is this Jesus anyway? He is the one supreme over all. What does he have to do with that little church in Colossae? He is the one supreme over all the church. And he had also asked, what does he have to do with you? With me? And the letter reader continues and will read, he is the supreme peacemaker between God and us. Back to Colossians 1, verse 21. Paul writes, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation, if you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. What does he have to do with you? What does he have to do with me? And Paul answers, here's what he has to do with us. He is the supreme peacemaker between God and us. You can understand what Paul might have been thinking. After all of the elevated, the exalted language of that first paragraph, Jesus is supreme over all. Jesus is supreme over all the church. He's the agent in creation. He's the one that holds it all together. After all of that language, he might be saying, people are going to stagger back in awe and say, that has nothing to do with my life. I'm just a common, ordinary person. You're talking about the exalted God of the universe. Where does that touch me? And so Paul writes and says, once you were enemies, cut off from God, but through the physical Jesus who came, he reconciled you. And then he finishes up with these very words, this is the gospel. That's what it has to do with you and with me. He comes bringing the gospel, bringing the news that says you can be reconciled to God. Because the grand and glorious God of the galaxies has someone on his mind, and it's you. There's a vacancy in his heart made for you. He has a yearning to have a forever friendship, as my friend Dwight Nelson says it, a forever friendship with you. And so he came in human flesh. The grand and glorious God of the galaxies wrapped himself in human flesh and stepped down the starry stair steps of the sky and came to you and invited you into fellowship. I want to be reconciled. That's what it has to do with you. You see, when we hear of that great God, we often think there are only two options in terms of how to relate to him. On the one hand, to cower back in fear at a God so holy. Or on the other hand, to try to domesticate him, to take away some of that grandeur. The priest, the sociologist, the writer and teacher Andrew Greeley years ago wrote of that with these words. He penned, much of the history of Christianity has been devoted to domesticating Jesus, to reducing that elusive, enigmatic, paradoxical person to dimensions we can comprehend, understand, and convert to our own purposes. So far, it hasn't worked. We can cower back in fear, or we can try to domesticate him. But Paul will have none of either. He says, yes, he is the God who dwells, who abides in light and holiness, unapproachable. But he's the God who 30 years ago walked with some of you and said, you know where there's water around here? I'm dying of thirst. That's Jesus. He came from there to here that he might grasp the hand of the Father and grasp your hand and bring them together and say, let me introduce you. He came to reconcile the two. That's what it has to do with us. I saw what it has to do with us in a man I knew. I suppose if it could be brewed, he would drink it. If it could be rolled, he would smoke it. If it could be injected, he would shoot it. I suppose if they said this car is faster than that one, he would test it. I suppose when they handed him money, he went through it like fire through a Kansas wheat field. That was just his life. That's who he was. You can understand then my utter astonishment after having gone some time without having seen him, to encounter him, to use the words of Scripture, sane and clothed and in his right mind. To have him say to me, hey, can we talk? And we sat down. To listen to him say what his newfound friend Jesus meant to him. And I was like, wait a minute. Excuse me, who are you? What happened to you? Well, I'll tell you what happened to you. What happened to you, to him, to many others, was that Jesus took his hand and the hand of the Father, and the grand and glorious God became the closest friend of a common disciple. That's what it has to do with us. And you sit by your friend, trying not to be obvious, but glancing out of the corner of your eye, wondering what's going on in his mind. He's on the edge of his seat now. His eyes are wide. You can understand why. If he only understood the full scope of what's coming his way. I have to tell you, I'll use the best words I've found so far to summarize what that reader is reading in this letter. These are from the New Testament scholar Curtis Vaughan, who writes this. Colossians proclaims the absolute supremacy and sole sufficiency of Jesus Christ. It is, as Robertson says, Paul's full-length portrait of Christ. He is God's Son, the object of the Christian faith, the Redeemer, the image of God, Lord of creation, head of the church, reconciler of the universe. In him dwells the fullness of the Godhead, and under him every power and authority in the universe is subjected. He is the essence of the mystery of God, and in him all God's treasures of wisdom and knowledge lie hidden. He is the standard by which all religious teaching is to be measured, and the reality of the truth foreshadowed by the regulations and rituals of the Old Covenant. By his cross, he conquered the cosmic powers of evil, and following his resurrection, he was enthroned at the right hand of God. Our life now lies hidden with God in Christ, but one day both he and we will be gloriously manifested. In short, the central thought of the epistle is summed up in the lines of Charles Wesley's hymn, "Thou, O Christ, art all I want, more than all in thee I find." Lord over creation, Lord over the church, reconciler between God and you. You look at your friend. He's staring at the floor, wide-eyed, overcome, overwhelmed, undone. And you lean over and you say, that is my Jesus. That's who he is. What he has to do with us, what he has to do with me. And then you take a breath and say, and maybe what he has to do with you. And then you can't resist. You ask. That's my Jesus. And you ask him the question that I would like to ask you. Would you like him to be your Jesus too? We're going to sing the closing hymn. As we do so, I want to ask you to allow the Spirit to permeate your heart with that question. That if you have never answered that question, if you sit like that friend, overcome with the charms of Jesus, at the end of the hymn, I want to ask you if you would like him to be your Jesus too.